This is your doing. Admit it.
Nonsense! You have no proof! The records show it! Shine!
Lies. You're twisting it.
It was a Saturday morning in early October, one of those cool, clear mornings where the air smells like dry leaves and cut grass, and the whole neighborhood feels like it's holding its breath. I had my coffee. I had nowhere to be. I was walking the perimeter of my yard the way I always do on weekends, not out of obsession, just habit. Something my grandfather taught me when I inherited this house from him 15 years ago. He used to say, know your land the way you know your own hands. Know every corner, every post, every inch. He wasn't being poetic. He was being practical. I'm a land use consultant. I've spent over 2 decades helping municipalities, developers, and private landowners navigate zoning law, property surveys, easement disputes, and setback requirements. I've sat across the table from city planners and county assessors more times than I can count. I know what a survey marker looks like from 40 feet away. I know what a legal description feels like when it doesn't match the ground truth beneath my feet. So when I walked my yard that Saturday morning and something felt off, I didn't dismiss it. I stopped. At first I couldn't name it. It was just a feeling, a slight wrongness, like when a picture on your wall is tilted 1 degree and your brain registers it before your eyes do. I stood at the back corner of my lot, where my wooden privacy fence meets the chain link along the rear property line, and I looked west, toward the Derrick property, Gerald Derrick, my neighbor of 11 years, a man I had exactly 4 real conversations with in all that time, a man who once asked me to cut my oak tree down because it dropped leaves on his side, a man who I had seen, on more than one occasion, stand at the edge of his driveway and simply watch me, not wave, not speak, just watch. I looked at the fence post closest to the rear corner. Then I looked at the property pin, the small iron rod that had been driven into the ground when the lot was originally surveyed back in 1987. The pin was still there. I could see the orange survey cap poking out of the grass. The fence post was not next to it. The fence post was 7 feet to the east of it. I set my coffee mug down on the ground. I walked to the pin. I crouched and touched it. Cold iron, solid, undisturbed. Then I walked to the fence post. I measured the distance with my stride. Not a precise instrument, but I've been doing it long enough that my stride is nearly exact at 33 inches. I counted. 7 feet, 3 inches, give or take 2 inches. The fence had been moved, not shifted by weather, not nudged by tree roots, moved. The post holes were new. I could see where the grass had been cut away in clean rectangles and then tamped back down. Someone had tried to make it look undisturbed. They'd scattered some clippings over the edges of the cuts, but the soil was still dark and loose beneath the surface, and the grass at the base of each post was too green, the kind of green that comes from freshly overturned earth. My hands didn't shake. My heart rate barely changed. I stood up slowly, looked across at the Derrick house, and thought, how long has this been here? I walked the entire western fence line. 212 feet of cedar privacy fence. Every post had been moved. Not dramatically, not 10 feet, not 15. Just enough to be deniable. 7 feet, running the full length of the property. That translated to roughly 1,184 square feet of land that was no longer on my side of the fence. That's a strip of land 1,400 square feet wide. Enough for a garden. Enough for a shed. More importantly, enough to matter legally. I picked up my coffee mug. I went back inside. I didn't call Gerald Derrick. I didn't knock on his door. I didn't even raise my voice inside my own house. I sat down at my kitchen table, opened my laptop, and pulled up the county assessor's property records. If you've ever dealt with neighbors who thought they could quietly redraw your world without you noticing, stay with me. Because what happened next was not a screaming match. It was not a fist fight. It was not a call to the police that goes nowhere. What happened next was 11 months of the most precise, deliberate, legally devastating sequence of events I have ever orchestrated in my life. And by the end of it, Gerald Derrick didn't just lose the 7 feet he tried to take from me. He lost his entire front entrance. The first thing I did, before anything else, was confirm what I already suspected. In disputes like this, your instincts mean nothing unless the documentation backs them up. I've seen landowners lose cases they should have won because they went into a confrontation with emotion and came out with nothing but a verbal argument on the record. I was not going to be that person. I had the original survey plat for my property in my filing cabinet, a habit I developed years ago from working with clients who didn't have theirs when they needed them most. The survey was dated August 14th, 1987, signed by a licensed land surveyor named Paul Wittig, and it showed my western boundary line with precise bearings and distances. The total lot width at the rear was measured from the rear corner pin to the adjacent property line. I compared those measurements to what I was seeing in the yard. The discrepancy was unmistakable. On paper, I had 34 feet of width from the fence to the rear corner of my house at the western side. I went outside and measured it again, this time with a proper 100-foot tape measure from my tool bag. The measurement I got from the current fence location to my house wall was 26 feet 9 inches, 7 feet 3 inches. Missing. On Monday morning, I called a licensed surveyor named Dale Whitman, who I had worked with professionally on 3 separate commercial projects. I trusted his precision and I trusted his paperwork. I explained that I needed a boundary survey of my western property line, and I needed it documented with photographs, measurements, and a written report. "You think there's encroachment?" he asked. "I think my fence has been relocated without my consent," I said, "and I need the evidence to be clean." He came out on Thursday. He worked methodically, the way good surveyors do, setting up his total station at the front corner pin, running his traverse along the legal description, confirming the rear corner pin. His equipment doesn't lie. When he pulled up his field notes at the end of the 4-hour survey, the numbers confirmed everything. My western boundary had not moved. The iron pins were where they had always been, exactly where Paul Wittig put them in 1987. The fence, however, was 7.2 feet east of the legal property line along its entire western run, varying between 7.1 and 7.4 feet at different points. Dale noted the fresh post holes, the tamped soil, and the disturbed grass. He photographed every post. He photographed both corner pins. He measured the distance from the existing fence to the legal boundary at 6 different intervals. His written report, which I received 5 days later, stated the following conclusion. The existing wood privacy fence along the western boundary of the subject property is not located on or near the legal boundary line as described in the recorded plat. The fence is located an average of 7.2 feet east of the legal boundary line, resulting in an unauthorized encroachment upon the subject property by the adjoining landowner to the west. Unauthorized encroachment. Those 2 words were going to become very expensive for Gerald Derrick. I made 4 copies of the report. I stored the original in my fireproof safe. I sent 1 copy to a folder in my cloud storage. I kept 1 on my desk. The 4th copy I put in a sealed envelope with the date written on the outside, just as a time-stamped reference. Then I knocked on Gerald Derrick's door. He answered in a robe, mid-morning on a Saturday. He looked surprised to see me. Not nervous, not guilty, just mildly inconvenienced. Gerald was 63, thick through the shoulders, with the kind of confidence that comes from never having been seriously challenged in his life. He'd been a regional sales manager for a hardware supply company and had retired early. His wife, Patricia, had left him 4 years ago. He lived alone now, and the house showed it. The flower beds his wife used to maintain had gone scraggly and brown. "Marcus," he said, my name, but flattened, like he was identifying an item on a shelf. "Gerald." I held up Dale Whitman's survey report. "My fence has been relocated. This survey confirms it moved 7.2 feet into my property. I need to know who authorized that work and when it was done." He looked at the report. Then he looked at me, not a flicker of surprise. "Survey mistake," he said. "The original survey was probably wrong. These old plats have errors all the time." I nodded slowly. The 1987 survey is verified by a second independent survey conducted this week. Both surveyors agree. The pins are where they've always been. The fence is not. "Well," he said, "I had some drainage work done back there a couple months ago. Guys might have bumped the fence posts. Happens." "Gerald," I said, keeping my voice level, "the posts were removed and reset in new holes. That's not a bump. That's a deliberate relocation." He shrugged. talk to my landscaper, and he closed the door. I stood on his porch for a moment. The morning was cold. A blue jay was screaming somewhere in the oak tree he'd asked me to cut down years ago. I looked at the front of his house, the wide concrete driveway, the brick entrance pillars, the mailbox centered in the middle of his approach. Something about the entrance bothered me, but I couldn't name it yet. I filed it away. I walked back across the yard, my yard, and I understood something very clearly. Gerald Derrick was not going to cooperate. He was going to deny, delay, and defer until I got tired and went away. He'd done this before, I suspected. Maybe with Patricia, maybe with someone else. He was used to outlasting people. He'd never met anyone who was better at paperwork than he was at waiting. 3 weeks after my conversation with Gerald, I received a letter from the Creekwood Hills Homeowners Association. The HOA in our neighborhood had been largely dormant for years. It functioned mostly as a dues collection vehicle that occasionally sent letters about grass height and trash cans visible from the street. The board consisted of 5 members, and I had attended exactly 2 meetings in 15 years. The letter informed me that I had been cited for a fence violation. Specifically, the letter stated that my fence was not properly aligned with community standards and that I needed to submit a fence inspection form within 30 days or face a daily fine of $25. I read the letter twice. Then I looked at the date it was postmarked, 14 days after my conversation with Gerald Derrick. I called the HOA management company. The woman who answered told me the complaint had been filed by a neighboring resident who reported that my fence was encroaching on a common drainage easement. She couldn't tell me who filed the complaint. She didn't have to. I already knew. I requested a formal hearing before the board. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse on a Tuesday evening in November. Folding chairs, fluorescent lights, a card table at the front where the 5 board members sat with their printed agendas and styrofoam cups of coffee. There were maybe 8 other residents in attendance, which was apparently a record turnout. Gerald Derrick sat in the back row, arms crossed, a studied look of boredom on his face. The board president was a woman named Sandra Holt, a retired high school principal who had taken the HOA role with the same energy she'd probably applied to running a school. She was organized, fair, and slightly intimidating. I liked her immediately. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, reading from her notes. "There's been a complaint filed that your western fence line may be in violation of a drainage easement that runs along the rear of several properties on Creekwood Court. Is there anything you'd like to say before we discuss?" "Yes," I said. I stood up. I had prepared a brief presentation, just a clear 2-page summary of Dale Whitman's survey findings, with a highlighted copy of my original 1987 plat. I handed copies to each board member. "My fence was moved," I said. "Not by me. I have a licensed survey from Dale Whitman Surveying, conducted November 3rd, confirming that my fence is currently located 7.2 feet east of my legal property line. The fence was relocated without my knowledge or consent. The drainage easement referenced in the complaint does not appear on either the 1987 survey or the current survey. I would ask the board to clarify what easement is being referenced and to provide the recorded document." Silence. Sandra Holt looked at the board member to her left, a nervous man named Phil, who seemed to be the one who had drafted the letter, and said, "Phil, what drainage easement are we talking about?" Phil shuffled papers. "It was referenced in the complaint. I assumed it was on record." "Do we have the recorded document?" Sandra asked. I'd have to look into that." I kept my voice even. "If the easement exists, it will be in the county recorder's office. I've already searched and found no recorded easement along my western boundary. If the board has information I don't, I'd appreciate seeing it. Otherwise, I would respectfully ask that this citation be dismissed and the matter referred back to the original complainant." From the back of the room, Gerald said, "This is exactly the problem with people who think they know everything. He's hiding behind paperwork." Sandra Holt turned and looked at him with the expression of a woman who has ended thousands of conversations with a single look. "Sir, unless you're a named party in this proceeding, I'd ask you to hold your comments." Gerald uncrossed his arms, then crossed them again. The board tabled the citation pending documentation of the alleged easement. They had 30 days to produce it. I already knew they wouldn't find it because it didn't exist. After the meeting, as people filed out, I held the door for an older woman named Ruth Phelps, who lived 3 houses down from me on the same street. She stopped beside me. "He had that fence moved in September," she said quietly, not looking at me. "I saw the crew. They came on a Thursday when most people were at work. 3 men, a truck, and a post driver. Took them about 4 hours." I looked at her. "Did you see the truck? Company name?" She shook her head. "White truck. No logo, but I can tell. You the time. Started around 9. Done by 1. Thank you, Ruth. Don't let him win," she said, and walked to her car. I stood in the parking lot for a moment. The air had turned cold. I could see my breath. I thought about Gerald Derrick in that back row, arms crossed, contemptuous, already moving chess pieces through a bored administrator he'd apparently cultivated. He had more connections in this neighborhood than I did. He'd been playing this game longer. But here was the thing about Gerald Derrick that he didn't know I knew. He was a man who made small moves, incremental moves, moves designed to be deniable. He had never faced someone who was willing to go all the way through the system, not just to the HOA board, but to the county assessor, the zoning board, the building department, and if necessary, civil court. I drove home. I made tea. I opened my laptop. I started pulling the Derrick property file from the county's public records database: deed history, permit records, certificate of occupancy, zoning classification, and, most importantly, the survey documentation on file for his property. That was when I found it. It took me 4 days of evenings going through public records, cross-referencing documents, and pulling the original subdivision plat before I understood what I was looking at. And when I finally saw it, really saw it, I sat back in my chair and was quiet for a long moment. Gerald Derrick's front driveway entrance was in violation. Not technically, not arguably, definitively. Here's what I found. When Creekwood Hills was originally subdivided in 1983, the developer filed a subdivision plat with the county that designated a 15-foot landscape buffer along the front street frontage of all corner lots. Gerald's property was a corner lot. It sat at the intersection of Creekwood Court and Millhaven Drive. The landscape buffer was a recorded condition of the subdivision, meaning it ran with the land and applied to every subsequent owner, regardless of when they purchased the property. Gerald's front entrance, 2 brick pillars, a concrete apron, and a driveway approach that met the public road at a 45-degree angle, was built in 2009. I found the permit. It had been approved by the county building department under a previous zoning administrator. The permit listed the entrance as being set back 12 feet from the front property line on the Millhaven Drive side. 12 feet, not 15, 3 feet short of the required landscape buffer. That alone would have been interesting, but there was more. The 2009 permit had been approved under a now superseded version of the county's residential zoning ordinance. The updated ordinance, adopted in 2014, had added an additional provision. Driveways on corner lots at intersections designated as residential collector streets were required to maintain a minimum 20-foot setback from the intersection curb line, in addition to the 15-foot landscape buffer. Millhaven Drive had been reclassified as a residential collector street in 2011, 3 years before the updated ordinance, and 2 years after Gerald's entrance was built. Under the current rules, Gerald's entrance should have been set back 20 feet from the curb line. It was set back, at its nearest point, 11 feet, 9 feet short, under current code. Now, here's where it gets technical. And this is important because this is the part that determines whether you have a legal lever or just an interesting piece of trivia. Non-conforming structures, things that were built legally under old rules but don't comply with current rules, are generally grandfathered and allowed to remain. That protection is real, and it matters. But it has limits. Grandfathering protections are typically lost when a non-conforming structure is substantially modified, expanded, or when the underlying use changes. And crucially, in this county and in many jurisdictions, grandfathering is also conditioned on the structure not having been the subject of a code enforcement action that was left unresolved. I dug further. In 2017, the county's Code Enforcement Division had sent Gerald Derrick a notice of violation regarding an unpermitted fence segment along the Millhaven Drive side of his property. The fence, according to the notice, had been installed without a permit and was within the landscape buffer zone. Gerald had submitted a response disputing the violation, and the case had been placed in a pending resolution status. It was still open. 7 years later, Gerald's 2017 code violation was still technically open in the county's system. He had never resolved it. The county had apparently never followed up. These things happen. Code enforcement backlogs are real, and cases fall through cracks all the time. But the consequence of that open violation was significant. It meant that the non-conforming status of his driveway entrance was not clean. There was an active, unresolved enforcement matter on the property that directly touched the same setback zone the entrance sat in. In plain terms, his entrance's grandfathered protection was legally fragile, and I could challenge it. But I wanted more than a challenge. I wanted certainty. I spent the next week talking to 3 different land use attorneys, not hiring them, just consulting, laying out the scenario and asking for their read. 2 of them said the same thing. If the open 2017 violation could be formally revived and resolved through enforcement, the driveway entrance would lose its non-conforming protection and would be subject to current code requirements, at which point it would need to be brought into compliance, which, given the current setback requirements, would likely require moving or removing the entrance entirely. The 3rd attorney said, "Who did he take land from?" "Me," I said. He nodded. "Then file the complaint. He handed you everything you need." I drove home that evening on roads I knew by memory, and I thought about Gerald Derrick standing in his doorway in his robe, shrugging at me, saying it was a survey error, saying it was a bump from a landscaper, dismissing me with a closed door. He had moved my fence 7 feet to acquire 1,400 square feet of my land. He had thought it was a small enough move that I'd either not notice or not pursue. He had counted on my inconvenience. He had counted on the complexity of the process discouraging me. He had no idea he'd handed me his front entrance on a platter. I went home. I didn't call anyone. I didn't celebrate. I made notes, organized my documents into a folder labeled with the property address, and went to bed at a reasonable hour. The next day, I started making calls. The first call I made was to Dale Whitman. I needed him to reinstall the proper survey markers along my western boundary, physically, on the ground, clearly marked with orange flagging tape and steel pins. This served 2 purposes. It created an undeniable physical record of where my legal boundary was, and it set the stage for the fence restoration that would come later. Dale came out on a Friday morning and set 4 intermediate markers between the 2 corner pins, each one documented with GPS coordinates and photographed. When he finished, the line of orange flags ran along the ground 7 feet west of the current fence. It looked almost absurd, a row of bright markers cutting through the middle of what now appeared to be Gerald's yard, because his fence had shifted the visual reality of the boundary for months. "You want me here when you do the fence work?" Dale asked. "Yes," I said. "I want photographs of every post placement relative to those markers." The second call was to the county's Code Enforcement Division. I asked to speak with the supervisor, a woman named Teresa Graves, who had been with the department for 18 years. I introduced myself as a land use consultant and told her I was calling on behalf of a property matter on Millhaven Drive. I mentioned case number 2017 CE U04471. There was a pause on the line. "That case is still showing as open," she said. "Yes," I said. "I'm aware. I have reason to believe the conditions that prompted the original violation have not been corrected, and that there may be additional violations on the same property that are directly related to the 2017 matter. I'd like to submit a formal written complaint and request a property inspection. You can submit through our online portal," she said. "If you want to include documentation, you can mail it or drop it off." I did both. I submitted a 17-page complaint packet that included a copy of the original 2017 violation notice, the subdivision plat showing the landscape buffer requirement, the current zoning ordinance's setback requirements for corner lots on residential collector streets, a copy of the 2009 driveway permit showing the 12-foot setback measurement, aerial photographs from the county's GIS mapping system showing the entrance location relative to the property line, and Dale Whitman's survey report on my fence, included to establish context for the broader pattern of property boundary misconduct. I was not going to give anyone an easy way to dismiss this. Teresa Graves called me back 3 days later. "I've reviewed your submission," she said. "The 2017 case was flagged for closure at one point, but was never formally resolved. Your new complaint has been assigned to one of our inspectors. I'll be honest with you, this will take some time. We have a significant backlog." "I understand," I said. "I'm not in a hurry." That was the truth. Patience is a strategic tool. Gerald Derrick had been counting on my impatience. I was going to disappoint him. The third call was to a civil attorney, not for immediate litigation, but to retain her services in the event that Gerald refused to restore the fence once the county documentation was complete. Her name was Patricia Okafor, and she specialized in property and boundary disputes. I had worked with her firm twice in my professional capacity. She reviewed my materials and gave me a frank assessment. I had a strong case for trespass and encroachment, and the survey documentation would be more than sufficient for a quiet title action if needed. She estimated that if we went to court, a judgment in my favor would likely include restoration of the boundary and attorney's fees. "Do I need to file now?" I asked. "Not yet," she said. "Let the county process play out first. It costs nothing to wait, and if the code enforcement action moves forward on the entrance, you'll have leverage that makes litigation unnecessary." I filed the attorney retainer. Paperwork. I made copies for my file. Then I waited. December passed. January passed. In February, I received a letter from the County Code Enforcement Division informing me that an inspection of the subject property on Millhaven Drive had been scheduled for March 8th. The letter was addressed to the property owner of record, Gerald Derrick, and I received a copy as the complainant. I don't know exactly when Gerald got his letter, but I know what day he knocked on my door. It was a Sunday in mid-February, and the knock came just before noon. I opened the door and Gerald stood on my porch. No robe this time. Slacks, a fleece jacket, his hands in his pockets. He looked older than he had in November. He also looked, for the first time in 11 years, slightly uncertain. "I'd like to talk," he said. "Sure," I said. I did not invite him in. We talked on the porch. "I got a letter from the county," he said, "about an inspection. It references some complaint." "I filed a complaint," I said, "based on my survey documentation and your open 2017 violation." He looked at me for a long moment. "What exactly are you saying they're going to inspect?" "Your front entrance," I said. "Specifically the setback from the Millhaven Drive curb line and the landscape buffer on the corner." He went very still, and in that stillness, I saw it, the first crack. Not fear, exactly. More like the look of a man who has just realized a door he thought was locked is actually standing open. "The entrance is 17 years old," he said. "I know," I said. "I've read the permit. It was approved by the county. Under a previous ordinance," I said, "and with an open violation on the same setback zone that was never resolved." Another silence, a longer one. "What do you want?" he asked finally. "I want my fence restored to the legal property line. I want the encroachment documented and remediated, and I want it done before March 8th. Gerald stared at me. Then he said, "You'd let the county come in over this?" I looked at him evenly. "Gerald, I didn't start this." He left without another word. I went back inside and made lunch. He hadn't agreed to anything. He hadn't said no. He was calculating the way men like him always calculate, whether it's cheaper to cooperate or to fight. I gave him the weekend to think about it. By Tuesday evening, I hadn't heard from him. I took that as my answer. The inspection was going to proceed, and I had one more thing to do before March 8th. I scheduled the fence crew for March 6th. The fence crew arrived at 7:30 in the morning on March 6th. There were 4 of them. A foreman named Isaac, who had done fence work for several of my professional clients, and 3 laborers. Dale Whitman was there too, standing at the property line with his field notes, directing the crew to the exact location of each survey marker. I had arranged for every post placement to be photographed before and after installation, with a measurement taken from the post center to the nearest survey pin. The process took the full day, 6 hours of work. They pulled the existing fence posts, Gerald's posts, the ones in the wrong locations, and stacked them on Gerald's side of the line. I was careful about that. I was not going to take his materials. I was going to restore my fence to my property line and leave his posts exactly where he could collect them. By 4 p.m, my fence was back where it belonged, running along the legal property line within 2 inches of the survey markers at every point. Dale Whitman walked the line one final time with his measuring wheel and confirmed the placement. He signed off on a written certification. The strip of land between the old fence location and the new one, 7 feet wide, 212 feet long, was back in my possession. It looked like a narrow corridor of disturbed earth with the rectangular ghosts of the old post holes still visible in the soil. The grass would grow back. The land was mine again. I stood at the corner of my yard and looked at it for a moment. Then I went inside and made dinner. Gerald Derrick came out of his house when the crew was loading their truck. He stood at the edge of his driveway and watched. He didn't approach. He didn't speak. Isaac told me afterward that Gerald had taken photographs on his phone for about 10 minutes and then gone back inside. Let him photograph. Let him document. Everything my crew had done was legal, surveyed, and certified. March 8th arrived cold and bright. The county inspector's name was Harold Fitch. I knew his work, not personally, but professionally. He had a reputation for methodical thoroughness and zero tolerance for pressure from property owners who thought the rules were optional. He arrived at the Derrick property at 9:15 in a county-marked vehicle, carrying a clipboard, a measuring wheel, and a laser distance meter. I was in my front yard under the pretense of retrieving my mail when he pulled up. I had no legal right to be at the inspection. It was Gerald's property, but I lived next door and I could stand in my own driveway and observe from a distance. Which I did. Harold Fitch spent 45 minutes at the front of Gerald's property. He set up his measuring equipment at the curb line. He measured from the curb to the nearest point of the entrance pillars. He measured from the front property line to the edge of the concrete apron. He photographed both entrance pillars from 3 angles. He photographed the intersection corner. He measured the distance from the pillar to the corner curb cut. At one point, Gerald came out of the house. I couldn't hear the conversation from where I stood, but I could read the body language clearly. Gerald was talking, gesturing, pointing. Harold Fitch was writing on his clipboard. He did not stop writing. After 45 minutes, Harold Fitch got in his vehicle and left. Gerald stood in his driveway for a long moment, staring at the street. Then he looked over at my yard. I had already gone inside. The official code enforcement findings arrived by certified mail 18 days later. I received a copy as the complainant. The report was 6 pages long, and its conclusions were exactly what I had anticipated. Finding 1. The existing front driveway entrance on the Millhaven Drive frontage of the subject property is located approximately 11.3 feet from the curb line. Current zoning ordinance, section 42.7C, requires a minimum 20-foot setback for driveways on corner lots along residential collector streets. The structure does not meet the current setback requirement. Finding 2. The existing entrance is located within the 15-foot landscape buffer established by the Creekwood Hills subdivision plat recorded in 1983. The structure encroaches into the buffer zone by approximately 3.7 feet at its nearest point. Finding 3. The non-conforming use protections applicable to this structure are affected by the Open Code Enforcement Action from 2017, case number 2017 CE 04471, which was never formally resolved. The open case constitutes an unresolved enforcement matter directly relevant to the same setback zone. Finding 4. The subject property is hereby issued a notice of violation requiring the property owner to bring the front driveway entrance into compliance with current zoning requirements within 90 days, or to apply for a variance within 60 days. Failure to comply will result in daily fines of $150 per day and may result in referral for legal enforcement. $150 per day for a structure that was going to be nearly impossible to bring into compliance without major demolition and reconstruction. I read the report twice. Then I filed it in my folder behind Dale Whitman's survey certification and in front of Patricia Okafor's retainer agreement. Gerald Derrick applied for a variance 2 weeks later. I attended the variance hearing as a member of the public. I had every right to be there, and I submitted a written comment opposing the variance on the grounds that the property owner had demonstrated a pattern of disregard for property boundaries, as evidenced by the documented encroachment on my property. I attached the survey report, the county's own inspection findings, and Ruth Phelps's written statement about the fence crew she had witnessed. The variance was denied. The zoning board cited the unresolved 2017 violation, the active encroachment matter on my property, and the proximity of the entrance to the intersection sight line as safety concerns. Gerald Derrick had 63 days left to comply or face the fines. His attorneys reached out to Patricia Okafor 3 days after the variance denial. They wanted to talk. The negotiation took 3 weeks. It was handled entirely through attorneys, mine and his. I never sat in the same room as Gerald Derrick during that period. I didn't need to. Patricia Okafor was precise and patient, and she understood exactly what we were asking for. The terms we requested were straightforward. A formal, written acknowledgement that the fence relocation had been unauthorized, full payment of Dale Whitman's survey costs, and the fence restoration costs, a recorded boundary agreement with the county confirming the legal property line, and a waiver of any future claims Gerald might try to bring regarding the fence placement. In exchange, I would withdraw my objection to a modified variance application, one that proposed relocating the entrance to the Creekwood Court side of the property, which had adequate setback clearance. Gerald's attorneys pushed back on the acknowledgement. They wanted the settlement to be silent on fault. Patricia Okafor held firm. Without a written acknowledgement, I told her, there was no settlement. We were prepared to let the fines run and to file the civil trespass action. The acknowledgement was included in the final agreement. The settlement was signed on a Thursday in late May. The following week, Gerald Derrick's contractors began demolition of the front entrance on Millhaven Drive. It took 2 days to remove the pillars, break up the concrete apron, and restore the landscape buffer to a natural state. The brick was hauled away in a rented dumpster that sat in his driveway for 4 days. The new entrance, smaller, simpler, without the brick pillars, was built on the Creekwood Court side of the property. It met every setback requirement. The variance was approved without objection because I had withdrawn my opposition. The process was clean. I watched the demolition from my kitchen window on the first morning. Not triumphantly, not with pleasure, exactly. It was quieter than that. It was the feeling of watching a scale return to level. Ruth Phelps stopped by my driveway that week while the demolition was still underway. She looked at the empty space where the pillars had been and said simply, "Good." "Thanks for the statement," I told her. "I meant what I said at the meeting," she replied. "Don't let him win." She smiled and kept walking. I didn't see Gerald much after that. He avoided the part of his yard that faced mine for several months. When we did cross paths in the street, putting out trash, checking mail, he looked away. I didn't force any interaction. There was nothing left to say. The boundary agreement was recorded with the county in June. My property line was now officially confirmed in a separate recorded document in addition to the original plat. If Gerald Derrick ever tried to sell his house, the boundary agreement would be in the chain of title. Any future owner would know exactly where the line was. My fence stood exactly where it was supposed to stand, where it had always been supposed to stand. The strip of earth that had been taken from me through 7 feet of fence posts and new dug holes had grass growing back by August. By September, I'd planted a row of arborvitae along the western line, not as a statement, just as a natural screen. They were small when I planted them. Give them 5 years, they'd be taller than the fence. I thought about Gerald's move sometimes, in the quiet evenings of that summer, about the calculation he must have made, that 7 feet was small enough to take, and that I was the kind of neighbor who wouldn't look too closely. He'd been living next to me for 11 years and had learned almost nothing about me. That was his real mistake, not the fence, not the entrance. The real mistake was thinking that the ground beneath his feet was more stable than the ground beneath mine. I spent 23 years learning how land works, how it's measured, how it's protected, how it changes hands legally and illegally, and what happens when someone decides the rules are for other people. I've seen developers lose multi-million-dollar projects because they ignored a utility easement. I've seen homeowners lose additions they built with their own hands because they missed a setback by 8 inches. The law around property rights is slow, but it is not forgiving. Gerald Derrick learned that in the form of a demolished entrance and a 5-figure legal bill. I didn't move his entrance. Out of anger, I moved it because he moved mine. If you've ever dealt with a neighbor who thought they could quietly redraw the world around them and get away with it, you know exactly how this felt. And if you've never faced it, I hope you walk away from this with one thought. Documentation is the most powerful weapon you will ever have in a property dispute. Not anger, not confrontation. Paper. Let me know in the comments what you would have done. Would you have gone straight to the lawyers? Would you have confronted Gerald earlier? Or would you have done exactly what I did, built the case brick by brick until there was nowhere left for him to stand? If you enjoy stories where patience and paperwork beat entitlement and arrogance, subscribe. There are more of these, a lot more, and every one of them ends the same way, with the boundary exactly where it was supposed to be.